Welcome back to Manufacturing Hub on Wednesday, live on Wednesday afternoon or evening. If you guys are watching us live at some other point in time, if you guys are listening on podcast form or otherwise. But no, everyone, welcome. Vlad and I are super happy to go continue down the data for manufacturing intelligence path. Today, we're going to focus on historians and kind of expand from there. So very excited to go ahead and get into this conversation and continue to build that technology stack. If you guys are new here, welcome. If you've been here before, welcome back. If you guys are new here, every Wednesday afternoon, Vlad and I have a super fun conversation, all things automation and manufacturing on Manufacturing Hub. And if you guys have questions or comments, we want to do our very best to go answer them. Sometimes we've got great questions that we can go answer. Sometimes, like I think last week, we had a bunch of questions at the end that we needed to come back to answer. If you guys have questions, please feel free to go drop them in the chat. If you guys have super technical questions, we may not get to all of them, but we'll do our very best to come back and go answer them after the fact. But without further ado, everyone officially welcome to Manufacturing Hub. This is episode 219, and would like to welcome our guest, Jeroen, to the show. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining and taking the time to speak with us today. I think it's going to be a very interesting conversation and highly relevant to all of absolutely highly relevant to all of our works, right, in data and in manufacturing. But before we get into that, I do want to ask you about your background, your maybe starting point in manufacturing, what your career path was like, and ultimately tell us also a little bit as to what you're doing today.
Okay, so my name is Jeroen. I'm based in Belgium. I'm the founder and CEO of Factry, a company specializing in historian and MES software for the manufacturing industry, of course. My background, I'm a bioscience engineer, so that literally has nothing to do with data or manufacturing, but I kind of always had an interest for IT, computer engineering, that kind of stuff. So after my studies, I got to work for Siemens, which, as you know, is one of the big industrial players. I got to work with doing projects and supporting projects for MES clients, so big MES project, dabbled a bit around in that space for about 2 years. Then I moved to Danone, a big dairy manufacturer, food and beverage space, where I did some MES OEE historian projects, but this time from a client perspective, not from a vendor perspective. So I gained some different experience there, working actually in factories and tailoring to the needs of the internal stakeholders rather than seeing them as clients. So that was a very interesting period as well. And that was right around the time 2014, 15, 16, where a lot of things were happening in the time series database space, right? So InfluxDB was popping up, a lot of others quickly followed. And I thought, hey, this is interesting. They're kind of doing this thing we do with historians, which is saving time series data, time-stamped data on a large scale. But optimized for performance, for query speed, and so on. So I thought, wow, this technology is really useful. Can't we apply it within industry and kind of do the same thing we do with historians, but then in a modern technology stack? So I tried that, wrote some connectivity, wrote a blog about it, and that's actually how the company got started. So since then, I think that was 2016, halfway 2016, we have been building on top of that idea and really build out a modern historian solution based on a new modern technology stack. That's a bit the gist of it.
Let me ask you, I guess, a follow-up before I ask you about the tech stack. In terms of the company, I obviously visited the website, but someone who's unfamiliar, do you provide consulting services? Do you actually provide the tools? Like, could you maybe explain the scope a little bit of what you do?
Yeah, we're really focused on containing our domain expertise into 2 software products, which we then also implement ourselves or together with partners. So one of those products is Factory Historian. The other one is Factory OS, which is more the MES component of the manufacturing data landscape. And both are really addressing the typical problems or typical data challenges we have on the plant shop floor in a modern technology stack. So both of these are offered as SaaS products where customers get the product and we install, onboard them, and then maintain it as well afterwards. So yeah, that's a bit what we do.
Based, I guess, on your experience, are you guys targeting a specific vertical? Are you in food and bev, or are you deploying across the board? And the reason why I asked that a little bit is I've had some conversations, I want to say, with people to some extent outside of the industry who are trying to understand these tools. And I guess even myself have researched a lot more in depth as to how different the verticals are. So I'm curious if you're building something for a specific or a set of specific verticals, or just across the board it should be applicable.
Well, that's actually a good question, because when you look at historians, particularly data acquisition or the core functionality, it's applicable to a wide range of verticals, right? It goes from steel over textile to renewable energy. And we actually have clients in all those spaces, but the more you kind of build on top, we see that feature-wise, we have a good fit with more batch-based process industry. So you end up in like food and beverage, you end up in specialty chemicals. So we really see a good fit within those industries for the technology we provide. Yeah.
Good.
So that's
I like that answer,
because to straightly answer your question, I think when we go to the market, we kind of focus our messaging on food and beverage and specialty chemicals, that kind of industries, fermentation, all of that. Yeah.
Gotcha. And let me, I guess, to take a step back, right? Because I think, SCADA and MES, I would argue, are a little bit better understood as components, but historians, especially for the end users, right? Because historians are, I would argue, rarely deployed by an end user. Sometimes, they do have internal teams, but a lot of times it is an external resource that purchases a historian and then deploys it to serve some other purpose, right? So I'm curious, maybe what is your definition of a historian? And then also, I guess, as a follow-up, we'll get into some of the nuances with the other technologies.
Yeah, good question. I think a lot of manufacturers are probably not aware that they're already running historians in the background sometimes, because back in the days, often they were kind of delivered together with the SCADA system as a kind of archiving module built in. So some of them already have historian technology running without actually realizing it. But to come back to the question of what a historian is and what it does, I think when you look at it, it has three main roles to fulfill. Like the main core one, the historian or the historian technology that has been existing already for more than 30 years is actually doing is data acquisition and storage, right? So archiving of sensor data, storing it, and kind of like the dash cam for your factory. So you have the data now, but you also have the data for 5 or 7 or 10 years ago. So it's really sitting next to that SCADA system, really acquiring and storing all that data in the long term. It's particularly good at that because it's optimized for this time series database, time series data, sorry. That's very specific, just simple time-stamped value data. The thing is, it's really in high volumes. So if you try to do that in a relational database, you'll quickly run into limits, performance limits, storage limits. So they're really optimized for storing and archiving that type of data. The second role it should fulfill is like the modeling and structuring of that data. So you have a lot of different sources within the factory, sometimes different SCADAs where the data is it's a very heterogeneous landscape. And a part of a historian's role is really to take in all of that data and to bring context and structure around it, like connect it to which asset it belongs to, add some engineering units, model events within your production plant, like you have temperatures, you have pressures, but you also need to know, okay, that was recorded during this production batch or during that specific shift. So that context is really important. And it's also what distinguishes them from classic time series databases. And then a third role it has to fulfill, and that's often overlooked, is really, I call it democratizing data access. So really giving people in the plant tools to explore the data that's being recorded, like to build trends, to find abnormalities, all that kind of stuff. So really give people that are not IT or not like very specialized people the tools to explore that data themselves. And if a historian can like fulfill these three roles, then they are really powerful when deployed correctly.
Let me ask you a follow-up before I pass it to Dave. Do you often see historians be deployed on their own, or are they usually paired with, a SCADA or an MES solution, right? And the reason why I ask is, you've mentioned a little bit of I guess that there is a feature of transforming or maybe contextualizing some of that data. So maybe I just want to clarify, are you expecting the historian to come with some of those features, or would those be, again, be built into your SCADA or MES modules in order to then pull the raw data from the historian and synthesize it a little bit better for the users?
Yeah, there is maybe a slight overlap, but historians are rarely deployed on their own. Like they are part of the manufacturing data architecture of a plant, and that architecture consists out of multiple tools. And MES is a good example. SCADA is actually often a data source for a historian, so they are kind of deployed on top of next to it. And like you mentioned, there is some concept of detecting production batches, and often we see a historian feeding data into an MES. An MES needs real-time data about what's happening on the production line, and a historian is often the interface for that MES system to get centralized access to what's happening in the process itself, right?
Mm-hmm. Understood. Dave,
so definitely part of an ecosystem or a broader architecture within the plant.
Absolutely. No, I agree. I was just sitting back and thinking of the times, and I've seen end users. Some end users are like, yes, we have this historian. Let's go find the one person who has the login so we can go look at the information. And then on the other side, I've worked with end users who have like an entire team of 3, 4, 6 people whose entire job is to go build on the historian and to go build the dashboards and to go build the assets and to make sure that all of the information is correct and up to date. And that for some of these more mature organizations becomes very much the backbone of the entirety of the OT team. So I think it's interesting. But I would also agree with the statement when you look at standalone historians, you don't see a lot of people who are just implementing standalone historians. And well, yes, or who are sometimes coming over the top of existing technology to implement those historians. And then I guess just for the listeners, and you guys are more than welcome to go add. I think a lot of the historians that I see and have worked with are some flavor of the OSI soft pie. Now, Aviva OSI soft pie, I don't know. Aviva purchased them. I don't know what the name is now, but of the OSI soft pie, which is your Rockwell historian, which is at least one flavor of Aviva's previous historians, which may or may not be a flavor of, I think, the Delta V historian in there as well. So I see a lot of that as a kind of as a main historian, and then I see more and more people on the Canary historian platform. Both super powerful tools, and so I'm always happy to go see those. I guess before any questions, and for the sake of going and bringing all of them out, do you guys have any specific historians worth also adding for the context for the listeners at home?
Well, I think you mentioned already a few of the big names. I also worked with a GE Prophecy historian as well. That's more in the GE space, but that's also been around for a while and quite robust. So those are that's definitely worth mentioning. And Factry historian as well, but that hasn't been around for that long, of course.
Yes.
Shameless plug.
For me, like what's interesting, and again, I think that's why this conversation I think is very important, is when you go to plants and depending on whom you talk to, right? It could be someone that's not necessarily dealing with the tech stack. They might be mislabeling the historian, right? And Dave and Jeroen, you mentioned this as well. They could be calling a database a historian, right? So they could be calling a QMS type of a tool a historian. So for me, again, it's definitely the tools that Dave has mentioned are the dedicated historians. But I think in conversation you will hear a lot of labels of historians just be a data source, right? Sometimes I've even seen brokers being sort of labeled that is our historian, but in reality, when you ask more questions, it is just, it is a funnel of a data stream, which then has some sort of a UI. So I think it's important to understand, right, as you've outlined, the features of what a historian actually does and paired with those brands. Because, I think I would say, and this is maybe a question for you as well, Erwin, is, we're having a lot of these data ops platforms, and I would say almost 90% of them are sitting on top of a historian of some flavor. But once again, from my experience, the end user will say, hey, that is our historian, where in reality, it is pulling from some kind of data source. So I'm curious maybe what you're seeing in terms of, again, this evolution of historians. Are they remaining pretty much the same? Is there a big difference between what has been available versus what is available today?
Yeah, I think when you look at the landscape, I think the needs in terms of data within a factory are evolving, and they're evolving quite quickly. So where historians or legacy historians were kind of built with the control systems mindset, more of a kind of archive and forget, or just in case we need it, and sometimes some specialized visualizations built on top, there's more and more a need for actually considering manufacturing data as a crucial part of the broader data ecosystem of an organization, of a business. So the need to connect that manufacturing data up to the modern, mostly cloud-based data infrastructure is expanding very, very rapidly. And I think that's also part of the reason of the success of these data ops platforms that either connect to a historian or to a very heterogeneous landscape of PLCs and different technologies in order to be able to get data out of the plant and into like an analytics tool stack. So that's a big evolution we see happening around it, and that's either with these data apps platforms or more historian technologies. It's something also we focus on that a lot, is being able to give that structured data or that data that's being collected back to that higher level ecosystem of analytics tools in open formats, so that people can actually use it on a higher level as well, which is a challenge where a lot of existing technologies still struggle with, right? Proprietary protocols or custom connectors, that kind of stuff. And it's really holding back the integration with this ever expanding landscape of analytics tools, AI. People are doing a lot of stuff with data. And when you go to manufacturing, you often hear the problem. It's very hard to get actual access to usable data. And that's a big shift where this historian functionality or this data ops platforms really need to address in getting data out of manufacturing and providing it to other systems and people.
Let me ask you, I guess, like a follow-up, on that side, right? So again, I want to make sure that we draw a concrete line when it comes to the definitions, right? So are you seeing, I would say, so the majority, or I guess like you've mentioned that historians a lot of times pull data through the SCADA layer, or they are paired with the SCADA, right? So would you expect historians to have modules to stand on their own without a SCADA, or is it very much so dependent on a layer that will pull and talk to, the devices of very, as you said, like sporadic or different protocols on the plant floor?
So I think it's not a strict necessity. No, it's just a very convenient way, because everything most of the times is already connected up to the SCADA. So it's like for a historian, it's one of those more centralized access points to get to data. But you don't have SCADAs anywhere. If you go to more discrete manufacturing, you'll see more standalone equipment that is automated on its own with their own PLC and that kind of stuff. So most historians have a kind of spectrum of different data collection modules talking different protocols from OPC or Modbus, which are already more generalized or standardized protocols, up to vendor-specific protocols like S7 or Ethercat or whatever, to really directly talk to different brands of PLCs and get the data from there. So SCADA is definitely rather a requirement, but and that's why you also see a lot of different connectivity options for historians. Moving to more modern applications, we more and more also see like MQTT-based data collection, where vendors actually implement an MQTT or expose their data over MQTT from the machine built in, or even REST APIs where you have to scrape the data. So it's really, those classic industrial protocols are now being joined by more modern data access methods as well. So it can vary depending on the situation. But in process industry, most often a huge part or a large part of the data is coming from a SCADA system.
Gotcha. Dave, what
Let me ask, I think it's interesting, and I think it's interesting kind of the process of what we see with connectors or a bunch of direct connections historically versus more MQTT offerings today. I guess the question or the area I'd like to dive in a little bit more is the decision to go down the path of purchasing and implementing a historian, right? It's not, I imagine for most people, it's we've looked at the options and we've decided to spend a significant amount of time and money going and purchasing and implementing this historian. In large parts of what I've seen, it is a major business decision that has significant ramifications. And I guess to be a little bit more explicit, I would imagine that every historian is going to cost in the hundreds of thousands of dollars between purchasing the licensing, or I guess many of the legacy historians that I've seen are going to cost in the hundreds of thousands of dollars between purchasing the licensing and hosting them and the time and consulting and other efforts to go in and to go create all of this. There are probably certainly newer ones that aren't nearly as expensive as that, but legacy looking wise, it is a significant business decision that not a lot of OT or IT departments have the discretionary funds to go make this decision, and now it just exists. So can we talk, I guess, in your experience, what that decision looks like, maybe the sort of conversations that you're having on the factory historian side? When are people saying, hey, we need a historian? When are people saying we need a historian? Is it part of an initial build? Is it part of a retrofit? Where does that part of the conversation normally fit in?
Yeah, that's actually a good question, and maybe it's important to distinguish between companies that already know and have a historian, or are at least aware of what a historian is, and other companies that are one step before that companies that actually realize that they have a use case for data, or they need to integrate their manufacturing data with the broader ecosystem, but don't have any clue about that's what a historian does, for example. So for the latter case, it most often starts with a use case, and then from there you build on top of them, and they start exploring the market, what's there. They find often they try it themselves with some out of the box edge to cloud connectivity, or they try to implement a time series database themselves, like InfluxDB or Timescale or QuestDB. And we see people from that space coming to Factry once they realize, okay, we're not a software company, we're a manufacturing company. So connecting all this stuff ourselves doesn't really make sense. We'll talk to Factry, and we want a supported solution with this industrial connectivity already built in. And that's one way they come to us. And then we go to the whole process of setting it up. And from the other side, we have the people who already have historians, but they also see this trend of, to be honest, a lot of these historians are also becoming more and more expensive, sometimes to the point where it's really one of the drivers of looking around and considering switching to a different technology. Or one of the drivers could be that they realize, okay, this system is no longer compatible with the modern needs of integrating data from manufacturing with modern technologies. So that's also a driver for coming to Factry. And then when you talk about the cost and the purchasing process, there's you need to distinguish one, software cost, two, implementation cost, right? So in terms of software cost, I think some of the more modern solutions, I think when you look at Aviva Pi or others, and then you look at Factory Historian, but also Canary, for example, are already a lot more accessible in terms of software cost, right? So different business models, different pricing models. So in that terms, things have changed a lot, and it's no longer hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's 10 and above, depending per production plant, depending on the scope, of course, and the features. And then you have the implementation or the onboarding. And that really depends. That can be from a few days to a few weeks to a few months, depending on use cases and in-house knowledge, right? We see clients that have really proficient IT OT teams that are really used to working with implementing these kind of technologies, who can do a lot of stuff themselves, who understand their process and can translate it into use cases, dashboards. So in those cases, a lot of the work can be done by teams themselves. In other cases, you have to rely on system integrators doing the work for you, and then it's just linearly correlated with the scope of the implementation, right? The amount of systems that need connections, the amount of use cases that have to be built, the amount of external systems that need to be integrated. So that's basically a linear function of the scope. So that's the two different parts to consider. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Vlad, what are your thoughts?
I guess, on that same train of thought, wanted to ask you, what does the architecture usually look like for you, right? So, and I guess the reason why I ask is, many customers still in the manufacturing space want everything to be on-prem, right? Even with multiple sites, you have on-prem servers that can host, I guess, whatever you throw at them within reason, right? Obviously, you can sometimes upgrade it or need to add more racks. But typically that's, at least what I see. However, there is this, I want to say, slow trend, and some have, I would say, mismanaged, I guess, those deployments. I'm not going to mention any names, but going to cloud or, passing data directly to cloud for these kinds of purposes. I think especially for time series data that is highly, I want to say, it needs to be highly available, it is very difficult to do so. So I'm curious if you can maybe expand a little bit on what you're seeing these deployments sort of take and look like, and how does the data maybe go from the plant floor to the actual historian, which components maybe are good to be on-prem, which components you'd see more, in the cloud.
Yeah, good question. Let me start all the way at the bottom at the data collection, right? So you're always or almost always in the OT network. So when you connect through OPC or to the PLCs, you're in the OT network. So those components are always at the edge. So they're always running inside the network of the client on site, and then either connecting to a system that is also running in the plants, that is running on a private data center of the organization, or is running in the cloud. So we see the whole spectrum when I look at our clients, from running on bare metal to running in Microsoft Azure. So it's really, we mostly follow the strategy or the policy from the clients, and they all have one. A preference for either running stuff in their own data centers, especially with large volumes of data and real-time data access. Some of them are still running it in the plant. But the most common one we see is data centers owned by the organization, or private environments in a Microsoft cloud or an Amazon cloud that is managed by the IT team. And then that's a very common deployment we see. Yeah.
Interesting. And I'm assuming that's very large. I guess, obviously, without telling us any names, these are large clients, or these are small to medium manufacturers?
Those are often clients that, medium to large, and they often service multiple production sites, for example, with a single historian, like a multi-site historian deployment. So it's managed by their IT team, and they're private cloud environment or their Azure environment, servicing different plants. But of course, the what you mentioned, the high availability of connecting to OT systems and reducing data loss, that's all handled at the collector level. So they usually don't care that that you have like 30 seconds of when the connection drops, the data is buffered and just backfilled and everything's back to normal. That typically doesn't matter that much. If it does matter, then of course you keep everything on-prem. But the critical connectivity part is always at the edge, and from there onwards, we see, as I mentioned, both in plant as in cloud systems. Yeah.
Interesting. I guess I have a slightly different personal perspective because a lot of my clients are still trying to migrate from fairly legacy systems, and their networks are certainly not up to speed. Same goes for the server deployments. There needs to be a lot of investments made besides just the historian or even the SCADA and MES software. There has to be a lot of upgrades of the very legacy networks, especially on the Rockwell side, the Data Highway Plus, device net, control net, before you can pull that. Obviously, there's ways to do it over those networks as well. But I think you want to invest to do it properly. You want to make sure you have the right, managed switch type of a network in place. So it's, I would say a lot of my conversations are around how can we first get it to store at the at the individual site, and then through MES maybe transform some of that data in order to present a report of how different sites are performing. But most of the data at the historian is not really funneled to cloud.
Yeah, that's indeed. We often also see that, right? When you have like a local historian and then a corporate historian that either receives all of the data or like a subset or a compressed format of the data, but then a kind of hybrid setup with one historian forwarding data into another one, local and then on a corporate level. Yeah, that's we often see that.
Absolutely. And if I can add, I have several, and I've worked with several kind of, I'll call them medium-sized organizations, who are cloud native, or have cloud capabilities as core to what they're doing, or have co-location servers sitting somewhere else, or both. And I think a lot of that is the newer organizations are investing in that infrastructure. And because they've invested in that infrastructure early on at the very beginning, they're leveraging some of these other cloud native tools. And so I think if the company is, I don't know, 5 to 7 years old or less, and it's a new or newish facility, then they have built that networking backbone. They've built that backbone in order to get to the cloud very quickly, comparative to the legacy groups like Vlad is talking about, who absolutely need to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars just in cabling and manage switches in order to network the facility in and of itself.
Yeah. There's a few comments. I'm not able to see all of them for some reason. I see that Dave replied to a couple of them, but there is a comment from Davi which we will bring up, and he mentioned that there's probably a difference between US and Europe. And now that I think about it, I think there's also maybe something to be said about when the plant was initially, I guess, built or established. A lot of, again, like my customers, the plants have been built in the 60s, the 70s, so there's a lot of that legacy equipment still in place. And maybe even if it's a smaller organization that is a little bit younger, that understands cloud, even though the plant itself is smaller, they will have, or I guess will be pushing for that capability. But I think there's for sure a difference between the markets as well. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
There are a couple of follow-on comments that make sense to go read. Now, he continues saying that he notices that medium-sized companies here are not afraid to do advanced vertical integrations and manage to build small teams with the capability to do it. And saying, and I'm looking from an outsider perspective because I've not lived here for the last 12 years. So I will, Jeroen, if you have comments of that, I am more than happy to let you have first crack at it.
Well, I'm certainly not an expert between on the cultural differences on that regard between Europe and the US. What we do see is there's, as you already mentioned, a big difference in maturity of organizations, and also in kind of, as I mentioned, we're mostly operating in process industry. When we look at discrete, we have a more like heterogeneous landscape that's often less connected than what you have in process industry, where processes are usually, pretty well instrumented and automated and already centralized in terms of data connection and control in a DCS or a SCADA system. So the network connectivity kind of comes with that. And as you mentioned as well, Dave, I think, in modern plants, like networking and access to the different data sources, it's kind of seen as a utility. Like you put water and electricity and compressed air next to a new production line, you will also install the necessary cabling for network connectivity and data exchange, right? So it's kind of, I think it depends on verticals, maturity, but of course, culture might also be a role. Yeah.
There's a good question in the comments, which I do want to bring up. I did want to ask you that as well. I guess I have my own kind of thoughts on this, but basically have you seen any applications where control is being done, obviously back from the historian based on whatever data transformation into the PLCs, either I'm assuming adjusting set points or doing any sort of start and stop, or maybe I guess controlling machinery back on the plant floor?
Yeah, I've seen few examples, not very common. I've seen a few examples, but an important distinction to make here, that you're not actually controlling, you're suggesting better parameters, or you're suggesting to the control system this might be a better fit, but the end decision or like the override is always in the control system. So it's not, it's kind of suggesting that there might be a better setting, but of course the control system always has the final say in whether or not to follow that command. So it's actually feeding data or feeding a conclusion into that control system, and then letting the control system take that data into its control loop and see whether or not to act on it. But yeah,
Okay.
we have seen, and most of the times there's different setups. You have this data going to a cloud, you have like a model or a kind of rule-based engine taking decisions, combined with data that's not coming from the control system, but from external systems. And then, feeding a decision or a suggestion back into the control layer. So we have seen examples, not of direct control, but more of like suggestive improvements.
Gotcha. Are you able to, I guess, like describe some of those applications, obviously without mentioning any names? And the reason why I ask, right, is I was part of a couple of energy monitoring projects a few years ago, and I guess the unfortunate reality, at least with the way the data was collected at the time, is I would have to go and look at the reports and then basically say, well, the line was not utilized during this time, so probably we can add some logic to turn off, let's say, conveyors that are just spinning, which will obviously with multiple items lead us to like a 20% savings. I guess like what you're describing is along those lines, but on a more automated level. And that's just, like one thought that I had during that project that was very tedious and manual. So I'm curious if you're able to share some interesting like applications on that side that might be relevant.
Yeah, I think I can share one. It's not from a production plant. We also have a client that operates wind turbines. Right, they're here. They're actually automated with Siemens control systems, just like the average process plant. And they are collecting data from that system, and they have like in inhabited areas, they have this problem of like shadow flicker, where when the sun's up and your turbine is rotating, there's like a really annoying effect on nearby offices and houses. It's like someone turning off and on the light switch every time the rotor passes by, right?
Okay.
So
Yeah.
when it's annoying, it's regulated. So they take into account like a 3D digital twin of the neighborhood with all the windows. and then they combine data from the wind turbine, whether it's running or not. They combine data from the whether solar sensors, whether the sun is shining or not, and then they combine it with the amount of hours or the amount of time that the specific window had already encountered this negative effect from that shadow flicker. And combining all this data, they will feed back into the control system, whether it's opportunistic to stop or to run the turbine in function of this broader data context. So kind of different context, but I think still a cool example of how this, how higher level systems can feed back data back to a control system. Yeah.
That's super interesting. I would never have guessed that problem. I guess now that you explain it, obviously it makes sense, but I would not have thought that is a problem that was being solved, via simulation or digital twin or control systems for that matter. So now, yeah, if you say there's regulations for that, I 100% believe you, and it's super interesting.
Well, and not only combined with the regulations, you of course you want to stop the turbines when there's not a lot of wind, right? You want to keep them running for the amount of time you can run them when there's a lot of wind, and thus you're generating a lot of power. So it's both a regulation and an optimization network. It's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Dave, what are your thoughts? I guess
No,
I do have some follow-up questions if you.
Oh, that's fine. So typically now's the point where Vlad continues asking questions, but he has offered it to me, so I will go ahead and add to it. But no, I think those are fantastic examples. And to Graham's question, I think it's a fantastic question. I have seen commands being sent from a corporate cloud historian, sure we'll call it a historian, down like to the start-stop to the PLCs. I have never seen it work well. So. So I've seen it happen. I have not seen it work well because at some point the extra 200 or 600 or 800 milliseconds of latency, it's a lot when you're standing there waiting for nearly a second of round trip. Once everything happens. So I've seen it happen. I have not seen it happen without significant issues. But kind of similar to the wind story turbine, I have seen groups looking to go kind of build above what we would call like the plant historian for similar process applications. And most of it is like significant regression analysis or significant other information where we're looking at upper lower limits of the production batch and saying, hey, we are, squeaking above and or below where we should be at this part of the process. As we move down the process, we know that we can go change the next machine settings to go bring this batch back within, to go bring the batch back within appropriate limits. So I have seen groups do that to a fair amount of success. That might be a bit more kind of higher level than Graham was specifically asking. And while I haven't worked on pharma groups who have looked at that, I know people who have worked specifically on the historian side of pharma groups who are looking to go ahead and stay within the much more strict parameters because the cost of a batch of pharma pills or pharma shots or pharma anything is extremely expensive. So I have seen some of that. I think that's interesting. Let me go ask the question. Do you imagine that we're going to see more groups going to the architecture of we've got more historians in the cloud, we're leveraging more of these cloud kind of capabilities, and we're funneling some of that information back into the factory so we can go make better decisions? Do you see that happening in the near future, or is that still a pipe dream for most of these groups because they still have all of that tech debt of 12 different communication protocols and networking that doesn't exist to allow them to get there?
Yeah, that's actually a broad question. I think when you talk about companies that don't really have this foundation of data transparency in order yet, I think that's the main challenge for them. I think the optimization and the expensive models to solve a specific use case, that's often only useful and valuable once the once the foundation is in order. Now, when that is actually happening, I do see tools and AI enabling more like distilled insights from that data being fed back to the people in the plant, but also the process itself. But mostly in the suggestive way I have mentioned earlier, like to enhance or to support a control loop or an operator controlling the process, just to give them as much input as possible, whether it's a control loop or the humans within the plant, to make the decision on their own or to enhance the decisions they have to make anyway. So in that regard, I see, the more mature organizations and manufacturing plants get in this digitalization journey, that's kind of a natural effect, I think, that will happen quite natural. Yeah.
Absolutely. Vlad.
Yeah. I guess I do have a question on, change management, because I believe it's a very important topic when it comes to having these, I want to say, difficult conversations, but highly relevant to data, historians, MES, and SCADA, right? So I'm, I guess, curious, when you're having conversations, maybe with clients that already understand historians or clients that are looking into their first historians, what does it usually take to not only convince them, to some extent, they understand the value of data, at least to an extent, but what does it take to have them get the ROI from the data, in terms of maybe training, in terms of deployment, in terms of actually going and optimizing their operations based on data slash suggestions slash AI?
Very good question, because I think most of these digitalization tracks or like implementing historian is one example, MES is another example, but basically anything that's bringing like digital tools on the shop floor is only half a technological challenge, but like half of it is also like people and a change management challenge, where there are different stakeholders that need to be managed, especially if you bring in this like a historian system. It touches upon many different aspects. It usually covers the whole plant, or at least a significant part of it. And then data collection is one thing, but then the modeling and the structuring of that data, you want to use a common language, you want to standardize how people look at this data, how people explore this data. You want to model it into an asset tree or in a namespace. This is also where concepts like unified namespace surface on okay, how are we going to expose this data to the organization? How are we going to train the people in actually using this data and being able to explore, to learn the tools to explore this data? And that requires real change management, involvement of different stakeholders, ranging from operators to process managers to plant managers. And much of the work is in bringing together those different stakeholders into kind of thinking about how are you going to model it. That's technology is just a small part of that, right? It's about okay, we're going to use this language, this model, this is how we're going to expose everything, this is how we're going to train people, because your data isn't useful if it's just sitting there. You want people to actually implement stuff on top of that data. And it's really an organizational aspect as well. I've seen clients kind of limit access to historian to a few select people within the organization, but I've also seen clients taking this really far and adopting the ability to work with these kind of tools and to really take it into the job description of certain roles within the factory. So if you're a maintenance technician, it's expected from you that you can kind of go into historian and create a trend or a dashboard to investigate a problem. So that's really bringing together technology with what is expected from people working in the plant, being able to work with that technology to enhance their job and to able to improve the organization from the perspective of all the different roles within the plant. So I'd say it's often overlooked or minimized, but the change management aspect is really important. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say, if I can add to that, right? So in my experience, I think the tools that you layer on top of the, especially historians, right? And we can talk a little bit on the MES maybe and SCADA sides, are extremely important, right? Because for me, a historian, again, has always been sort of this behind the scenes engine that people obviously understand what data goes into it, but ultimately needs to transform the data for most users, right? Because for me, I still want to look at the raw data in its form and understand what kind of issues are happening, with sensors or with devices. And I've experienced the pain points of, troubleshooting servo motors that are, for whatever reason, over torquing, and then you need to present the data to, an engineering manager or director in order to make a call. But ultimately, a plant manager is not as concerned about the state of change of a specific sensor. He wants to see a report on a weekly or monthly or shift basis in order to make maybe a financial decision, or hey, we're going to schedule this specific batch to run on those lines. So I think, maybe having the conversations about the tools, which, as you mentioned, is a little bit tricky sometimes, is also very important. So maybe to get your thoughts on, as you talk about historians, maybe what are some of the other modules that plants should be at least thinking about of deploying in order to synthesize some of the data that they're getting from the plant floor?
And you're talking about historian data, singular, or you're talking about the broader landscape?
I would say like the broader landscape, right? Like maybe some MES. You mentioned batching a lot, right? So I think that usually for me, like when you say, batching and batch tracking, that's not going to be part of a historian. That's going to be more of an MES module, right? Same as the quality management, that's going to be kind of inside MES or maybe a standalone thing. So I guess I wanted to maybe get you to expand a little bit, like what other tools could be tying into a historian and what kind of value they could be bringing to different stakeholders in a plant.
Yeah, I that's a very broad question. I think there's a lot of tools, or when you look at like when you go up to the MES space, there's it's kind of more of a set of functionalities that's often considered as being an MES. But I think a historian usually limits itself to data acquisition, structuring, visualization, and kind of passing it on to other systems. And such other systems can be, or is in many cases, an MES, or at least some form of MES that handles more of the production execution rather than the monitoring. So handling the production planning with process orders, material management. There's the quality aspect that's often part of it integrated in an MES, but it can be a standalone system as well, where operators, for example, they take samples from the production line and do tests on these samples or send them to the lab. They register them in a LIMS system for like quality analysis afterwards. There's like this checklists. There's application managing work instructions for the operator. There's OEE applications that sometimes are integrated with the historian, sometimes part in the MES system. So there's a very broad, I say, set of functionalities that can be covered by different systems. So we often see MES being very minimal, and then the ERP covering immediately. I call it sometimes that the ERP comes down to the shop floor a bit more than usual in those cases where, for example, the order management is done directly in ERP. But especially when the production execution is very much automated and tightly integrated with the process, we typically see very expensive like MES applications covering, everything from when an order is like released from an ERP system all the way through the process, through declaring the output that has been produced, managed by an MES system.
Dave, any thoughts on that side?
I think it's interesting, and I would agree. There are an endless list of systems that can be additive to a historian, or you may start with and then go add a historian in. And I think a lot of those, the lists are really good. I think it really depends where you are, like especially if you talk about a LIMS or a QMS, that is probably going to be a group who is really worried about quality, really worried about the raw materials that we're putting in, really wants to go make sure, hopefully it's all of our food and beverage groups. It's not, but hopefully it's everyone that goes and makes and touches our food, are really interested in something along those lines. And then like on the opposite side, I know a lot of the entry points are on the OEE side, right? On the how am I running? How can I go run more? How can I reduce downtime and increase throughput and reduce scrap and all of those, which generally kind of lead to some of the other solutions or might lead to some of the other solutions, depending upon the group. So I think that is, I think that's a very good list of these. And if for all of our listeners at home, if you guys are listening and one of these is of interest, you guys might be you guys might be in the process, or hopefully might be in the process of looking for a historian, because all of these can feed and or be fed from a historian, which is really good. Let me ask.
Or even be built by visualizing the data in the right way, because often we see plants purchasing like dedicated solutions, for example, energy monitoring, which is like hardware and software all combined. But often they buy many of those solutions for different problems they have, and then they end up with some kind of disconnected set of point solutions.
Yes.
Which kind of, when you take a step back and you kind of fill in the need for a data foundation first, which is you need to have a bit broader strategy then, but it often results in you being able to really quickly implement those functionalities on top of a historian, perhaps combined with MES data or combined with ERP data, instead of purchasing separate point solutions and cover a lot of your needs, but with a single platform and all the benefits that come from having all the data in a single platform. So that's maybe also an important nuance. And we were talking historian MES. There's a lot of other digital tools in a plant, ranging from apps on an iPad to like standalone vision systems that do some quality analysis and also generate data about rejects and waste. But I think, if we try to think of them all, we can we can go on for a bit, I think.
I agree. And I would add to that, Vlad and I have talked at length about potential point solutions versus building a system. And I think we all generally agree that the majority of the time, a point solution is not going to, or a point solution or 100 point solutions is not going to be where the majority of end users want to be. It makes more sense to invest a little bit more time and at 100 point solutions, not all that much more money, and have that clear and concise vision of the direction you want to go and that single source of truth that you want to go have at the very core. So I completely agree. I completely agree with that. And one of the things that we didn't necessarily get involved in is kind of the visualization, some of those other tools built into the historians. And you had listed kind of some of those three key things that what is a historian or what is a modern historian. And very much kind of that data visualization. I would say on the best teams that I have worked with, they are very skilled in going and finding the correct data and manipulating that correct data in order to go provide the majority of the answers. So in my time working as an integrator, going and building some of these OEE or other solutions, I then go look at some of the people I know who were building solutions on a historian, and we're like, hey, we can basically build the exact same solution. It's very much the question is, how do you want to come about going and building, and what makes sense to go build in a historian versus what makes sense to expand beyond the historian.
I think. Sorry,
please
go ahead.
No. Please go ahead.
Well, what we say we can build into the historian kind of triggered in the sense that you don't always need to build something to test a certain hypothesis. Sometimes you just need to give people tools to explore, like one-off thing they want to investigate. And in that sense, I think it's a really important aspect for a modern stack to give as much as possible, or an audience that is as broad as possible, so technically skilled but also less technically skilled people, the tools to work with data. Because if a process engineer in the plant, they have a hunch about something going wrong, and instead of having like to log a ticket to IT to get like a graph in their mailbox 3 weeks later, that really slows everything down. So if you give that person the ability to kind of explore themselves and figure it out themselves, that's where the magic happens, in my opinion, because it's the person with the domain expertise that is able to back up that domain expertise by exploring the data themselves. And if an organization manages to combine these two and to enable those kind of people with data, that's where a lot of innovation and magic happens, and organizations really can take velocity and continuous improvement and that kind of stuff. And I think that's really powerful and really one of the key aspects going forward with adopting tools in manufacturing.
And that's a very good point, right? Because I think we haven't spent enough time like talking about this, but after, or I guess during the deployment phase, obviously for us, a PLC is or a control system, and PLC is a control system, but ultimately someone needs to come in with domain expertise. And you have an interesting background, again, which we've talked about at the beginning, where you understand the process. You need to actually be able to look at that data and, again, yourself to some extent synthesize what can be improved, what can be changed, what can be, maybe trialed. And of course, the perspectives of different stakeholders are always going to be different, but that entire mindset of you need domain expertise and understanding of the process is extremely important. So I guess maybe going back to my earlier question, right, how would you approach all these like different verticals and industries? Because for me, again, a process plant for food and bev manufacturing is very different. And like I said, I had some recent conversations where it seemed like it was not apparent to the other party, but it's very different from, let's say, an automotive plant. And then it's very different from oil and gas, right? So those industries are fairly different. So my question would be is, how do you approach some of those conversations and maybe guide also to some extent the customer or potential customer into understanding that they also need to take some, I don't want to say responsibility, but I guess they need to know the domain in order to utilize the data in order to get the ROI at the end of the day?
Yeah, I think it all boils down to what we already discussed in a little sense, that in many cases it's about combining the people with the analytic skills with the people that have the domain knowledge, right? You can give a highly skilled data analyst as much data as you want. Sometimes an operator who's been at the production line or in the plant for 20 years will just have a single look and in a fraction of a second know what it means. Well, that data analyst just doesn't have that context when he's looking at the data. So I think the combination of both, analytics skills and domain expertise is really critical, no matter the industry, I think.
Good, makes sense. Dave, thoughts?
Absolutely. I completely agree. And again, I feel like we're somehow an hour in, and we've only briefly scratched the surface of historians. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. This definitely deserves a follow-up and continuation of the conversation. Jeroen, this has been fantastic. Before we let you go, we do want to ask you the questions that we get to ask all of our guests. And for our longtime listeners, everyone knows the first one is one of my most favorite. It is predict the future. So what do you think the future of historians look like in the next 3 to 5 years?
I'm always very careful with predicting the future, to be honest. But I think predicting the future, there's a lot changing in like the technology landscape, right? I think when I open my LinkedIn feed, for example, it's probably the same for you guys. There's like a new tool or a new model or a new AI model popping up and improving. So I think that will definitely have an impact in how we consume data, also in manufacturing. So for historians, I think this whole AI trend will have an impact on how we consume data from historians and being able to bring that data to more and more roles within the factory so that we can really use it to support people in making decisions by contextualizing or presenting data in a way based on the perspective they have or the questions they want to ask without needing to be SQL wizards. So I think where historians are going is just getting data in the hands of more and more people and supporting them in making better decisions every day. That's how I would wrap it up. And historians and structuring data within historians play a key role in that regard.
Absolutely. I love that. I agree. I will also add that nothing scares me more than watching people just write SQL queries to a live database in a facility. For me, that is the highest risk thing that I feel not enough people go highlight of, hey, if someone writes the incorrect command, we've just lost everything and have to go potentially rebuild a significant amount of work in the facility. So I completely agree with that. Thank you so much. Next question we want to ask is for some career advice. If someone was looking to get into industry, their earlier mid-career, and maybe they want to go focus more of their attention on the historian side, and they want to go find some opportunities to work with historians, be it at an end user, or they'd like to go find an opportunity to work with a group that is building and selling historians. What's the best piece of career advice you would give them?
There's there's a lot of influences on how a typical career or how one ends up in the position they are after
Yes.
10 years or 20 years. I think one of the things I valued most or was given the opportunity to really dive into the nitty-gritty of data and really was given the opportunity to solve problems myself within a factory environment and to get down and struggle with what we're all struggling for, not getting to the data or systems not responding the way we are used to, and then just a broad interest in technology, IT technology specifically, combined with having a bit of experience in the field, working in a plant, working with different systems. A combination of those skills is not often easy to find. You either only have the field expertise or only the IT and systems expertise. So being able to combine those or actively looking to combine those can be quite a differentiator, I think.
Absolutely. I completely agree. Finding someone who has both of those competencies, or even a desire to know both of those competencies, is certainly a diamond in the rough, if you will. Next question for you is: I know you've got some content recommendations for us, and would love to hear what that recommendation looks like today.
Yeah, so in terms of content, I'd like to mention some of my fellow Belgians in the space. That's the guys from the IT OT Insider. They're like, I can post a link afterwards here. So they also have a podcast, they also have a blog, and they try to kind of bring down all the hype around Industry 4.0, UNS, everything that is happening into the industrial data landscape, and try to cut through the noise there with some really interesting concepts on how to tackle these challenges within the industrial data space. And I think they are really worth mentioning here as a valuable source for people that are looking to learn more about that.
Absolutely. No, fantastic. Thank you so much for that. We will, as always, make sure to go post links for all of those things, and all of the items that we've talked about early in the show notes, or in the links below for anyone listening. Jeroen, this has been a fantastic conversation. Hopefully the first of several we get to have with you. But we want to go ask you the last question we ask everyone is: how can our listeners help? Who should reach out? Who are you looking to connect with? Is Factry hiring? Are you guys looking for new clients? Kind of your open platform to go ask our listeners anything that you'd like.
Well, you already mentioned two. So we're, of course, actively looking to help onboard more and more clients onto our platform. We really believe we can make a difference for a lot of manufacturers in helping them get the most out of their data. So we're also actively hiring both commercial and technical profiles to help us do so. But I'm also personally very interested to learn from people, to have stories about what people have already tried in this space, what worked, what didn't work, how they succeeded on an organization level or on a technical level to connect systems and to get people to work with data. So people who have something interesting to share can always reach out to me on LinkedIn and share their story. It would be very excited to connect with them.
Fantastic. No, thank you so much. I will make the notes to anyone, especially watching on LinkedIn or watching live, that everyone is tagged. Jeroen is tagged. Factory is tagged in the post, so you guys can go ahead and find that and connect and learn more. I guess I do have one specific factory question that if someone is interested, they probably would like to know. So you guys are you're Belgium. You're in Belgium. Are you deploying throughout Europe? Are you deploying throughout North and South America? Throughout Asia? Where are you guys actively in the process of deploying?
Well, I'm proud to say that our software is running on 5 continents now. So that's something. In some continents, it's still very limited, but our market is mostly Europe and US, North America, Canada. So that's where most of our deployments are. But we have been, and that's also inherent to this day and age, we've been able to build the business from Belgium, from Ghent to be specific, like servicing clients all over the world, most of it remotely. So that's inherent to using modern technology. We can deploy our stack within the factory environments on the other side of the world without even being present. So yeah, that's not a problem.
Fantastic. No, awesome. Thank you so much. And everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Again, I've already done the please go connect with all of us part that I would normally do at this point. So just last comments, make sure that you're following Manufacturing Hub. If you're watching on YouTube or if you're listening on podcast format, you guys are awesome. Please make sure to go ahead and do the like and subscribe and follow along and share and all of those other